when I was sent the book, The Mare, to read, I had no idea what it was about. And I opened it up and started reading and thought, oh my gosh, has Mary Gaitskill written a YA novel? Is this a young adult novel? Because it's the story of a young girl, Velveteen Vargas. She's 11 when we meet her, but we follow her through for 5 years until she's 16?
Actually, it's only 2 years.
Okay. It felt like longer to me. In a good way, an epic journey. But so, you know, she's going, her mother has enrolled her and her younger brother, Dante, into the Fresh Air Fund, and they're being sent from their home to upstate New York to a childless couple, middle-aged couple, and they're going to spend the summer, well, Velvet, they're going to do different homes. Velvet's spending the summer with her. And so we sort of follow, from those encounters, we follow these developing relationships over the course of the novel. So was that whole idea of young adult literature in your mind when you approached writing this, or what's the connection?
Well, I did intend to write a young adult novel at first, although that is not my natural inclination at all, and it wasn't something I was sure I could even do. It happened in kind of a strange roundabout way. I was teaching in Syracuse at the time, and Syracuse was fairly far from where I actually lived, and so I had to rent a room in a boarding house when I was up there. And the woman who ran the boarding house had the television on nonstop in the kitchen. So one morning I came stumbling down to make coffee, and on the television was this little American movie classics blip of National Velvet with Liz Taylor, 15 years old, riding across a Technicolor meadow, beautiful, romantic vision. And I looked at that and thought, I wish there could be a movie like that about a Latina girl. And the reason I had that thought specifically was that I knew a Latina girl who was very close to me who was just, she was about 11, 12 years old at the time, and she was a very romantic girl, like a lot of kids that age are, and she just loved movies about princesses, and there just weren't very many movies with Latina characters, and I realized that that was important to her, which again was foreign to my way of thinking most of the time, but I saw how important that was to her. And there were movies like Girl Fight about a tough Latina boxer, and she just wasn't interested in that. She wanted something, a romantic, beautiful story. So I really thought, I wish there could be that story, because she liked horses too. And I thought, well, I could never write that though. Maybe though I could write a treatment. I didn't think I could write a screenplay, certainly not on that subject. But I thought maybe I could write a treatment and they could find a Latina screenwriter who could actually do this. That might be great. So I called my film agent and proposed this idea, and he said, nobody makes movies based on treatments anymore. If you're wondering what a treatment is, it's some people in the past used to write like an outline, basically, that could be a page long or 30 pages long, and it could conceivably be sold, the story idea be sold to someone else who would then write the movie. But he said, nobody does that anymore. If you want this to happen, you have to write a YA novel. And I said, I can't do that. That's impossible. And he said, well, you can try to do a treatment, but I don't think it's going to work. So I wrote a 30-page treatment, very detailed, gave it to him, and he said, I can try, but this is just too confusing. It doesn't know whether it wants to be an uplifting Walt Disney story or a gritty urban story. And I said, well, it wants to be both. And he said, okay, I'll try. But I don't know how hard he tried, but nobody was interested. So he said, you've got to do it yourself as a book. And I said, well, I can't. So I dropped the idea. This was back in 2007. I had no intention of going forward with it. For one thing, I thought I just couldn't do it. I'm a white person. I don't know enough about, I did have know a Latina girl who lived in Brooklyn who I was close to, but still, that's not the same as inhabiting her skin and knowing her life from the inside. And also, I know quite a bit less about horses, or like I did. And so I just thought, it's impossible. So I put the idea completely out of my mind, except that it kept coming back over a period of 2 years, just out of nowhere, I would be like at an airport or grocery shopping, and an entire scene from the book would come into my mind. Dialogue, powerfully, vividly come into my mind, to the point that my hair would stand up on the back of my arms, or on my arms, and that's never happened before.
That's never happened with the other
No.
books that you've written? Wow.
No, I've got no history of that, so it kept happening. I thought I was going through a difficult time in my life personally, so I thought maybe I was just going crazy. But either that, or I thought it's a very strong intuition, and so I finally, in 2009, decided I would try to do it. I put my other book aside, and I wrote maybe 50 pages and gave it to my editor, and just to see what she would say, and she said, "This is great, I love it." So that gave me the courage to go forward, and that's how it happened. And she did say, though, the way I made it work in my mind is I thought, if I try to do it exclusively from the girl's point of view, it will fail. But if I divide it between her point of view and that of a white woman, somebody who at least fits my demographic, I can make it work. So that actually took it out of the category of being a YA novel. Technically, if it's half of it's an adult point of view, then it's no longer considered YA technically.
Well, will you read from it so people can get a sense of...
Right now?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. People can get a sense of your non-YA, non-movie novel.
She's from Crown Heights, Brooklyn, but she winds up getting involved with a middle-aged white couple upstate New York through an organization, which is a real organization called the Fresh Air Fund, which takes inner city kids up to stay in country environments. It's a very kind of strange and interesting organization, but anyway, that's how she gets up there, and she gets involved with this couple, and she gets to know a stable of horses next door to them, and particularly a horse there named Fugly Girl, who she renames. But she's also, I mentioned this because I mentioned him, she's in love with a boy named Dominic. Not when she's 11, this is a little older, a little later in the book. I woke up thinking about his nose, the little dent in it, about how his eyelashes and eyebrows made his eyes soft, but how inside they were strong. His lips were tense like a muscle, but still his mouth looked like kisses. Soft, strong, tight, full. He had everything I already knew about, but other things in between. Dominic. Then my grandfather's voice came in my ear and made me jump out of my dream. He was saying, "You promised." I hadn't heard it in a long time, but I knew what he meant right away. It was my last night, and I still hadn't taken my horse out, like I said. I was treating her the same way everybody else did, and for the same reason as them. If it was just me and her, without Pat or Beverly there, I was a little scared of her. So I made myself get out of bed. I got dressed with music in my head. Love. Is this love? What is this feeling I have in my heart? The voice like a ribbon, unwinding, giving feeling. I walked out on the path, and the song ribboned in the sky, in the clouds, which were dark with the moon behind them. When I got in the barn, the music left my head, but stayed in my body. The horses woke up around me like they could hear it, and started talking to each other. My horse was looking like, "Girl, what you thinking about?" I took the halter down from the hook and opened up her stall. She put her head up like, "It's night. We don't do this at night." I came to her with my head low. I talked to her like she was a kitten. She let me come to her and touch her on the neck. She seemed like she was trying to decide, and then like with this little move inside, she put her head down for the halter. When she came out of her stall, the air rolled around her like water when a boat comes by, and it felt good to me, and I wasn't afraid. I felt her with me, wondering what I would do. All the horses watched, and they wondered too. I could even see a cat watching at the mouth of the barn, its ears against the sky. But when I put the saddle pad on, she moved sideways. She pushed out her belly so I could barely get the saddle on. I went to put the bridle on over the halter, but she fought the bit, tossing her head even with my arm around her face. I got the crop from the wall, but then I felt stupid, because what was I going to do with it? Her eyes stared, and I smelled my own fear. I felt the scars on her face like they were on me. I put the crop back and made my body quiet. I pet her shoulder. I tried again and again until finally she took the bit. I put the chain on her nose and let her out. In her eyes and on our skin, we felt the night. I felt her scared of it, felt her start to walk backward, and I turned her in a circle hard to the indoor ring. She calmed and let me take her there, but when I turned the light on, some birds flew in the rafters, and again she walked back. I forgot how big she is, and I pulled her like a dog on a leash. And oh my God, she reared up and beat the air with her feet, killing hard. The lead line burned through my hands, but I held it, and she came down, and I turned her in a circle 2-3 times. She followed, and I felt like our minds were pressed together, each feeling where the other one was. I remember what Pat said. You tell a gelding, command a stallion, but you better beg a mare.
It's a great scene. It has so much packed into it that I wanted to ask you about in terms of the book. And one is the feelings. There's so much discussion of feeling and of trying to connect with one another to their feelings. Ginger, who is the white woman that Velvet ends up staying with and becoming friends with after the summer, talks about the signal or the radio, like tuning into something. And Velvet talks about seeing the distance or her legs on, the legs on a horse, like these almost instruments for tapping into other people or beings. What were you trying to tap into with that kind of emphasis on feeling?
Well, with horses, between horses and people, of course, that's very important because that's how animals and human beings communicate. With words partially, but it's mostly by body language and touch. So that would be very important with and seeing the distances about knowing when to jump. Mm-hmm. It's very important there, but I also think I think people do that much more than we realize. I think it's unconscious a lot of the time, but I think we understand each other very much by body language and by signals in the eyes and voice in voice and tone of voice and even gestures with the hand. I think we communicate with our bodies way more than we know, even now. We're less attuned physically now than I think we've ever been before because of, obviously, a lot of people's lives take place online. But even so, when you're physically in somebody's presence, you are responding to them as an animal.
How did you get involved with, so the Mare is about many things. It's about, it's a coming of age story. It's about motherhood. But it's also that kind of narrative, whether you've ridden a horse or not, there's something about the girl and her horse that just feels like the ultimate tale of girlhood. How did you get to horses?
How did I get into that idea?
Yeah, or why did you decide, okay, because you could have written about Velvet without the horses, I suppose, Velvet and Ginger, but why did you want to write about horses as well?
I don't think I could have done it without the horses, as to me that was actually the most important part of it, or one of the big parts. Just intuitively, it's for one thing, like I said, the young lady that I did know liked horses. She wasn't like Velvet exactly. She wasn't in any way really, but certainly she did like horses very much. She didn't have the kind of ambition or intense talent, though she was talented, but it wasn't that kind of extraordinary talent that Velvet has and determination. Though Velvet is pushed into it also somewhat by the trainer she works with. But there is something very powerful and beautiful about a connection with a girl and a horse. I never had that. I didn't dislike horses, but I didn't have any real feeling for them, even though I like animals a lot. But I could see, it's odd, because we did happen to live next door to a stable, and I just had the feeling that this girl would really like horses. I would have taken her over there anyway, just because I think all kids like to look at them anyway. But I just had the intuition that she would really like them, and she really did. She could spend hours over there just grooming them, and she was not a particularly kid who was interested in cleaning. I had to argue with her to get her to do dishes and stuff like most kids, but she was happy to spend hours over there cleaning the stalls and grooming them and doing whatever work was there just so she could spend time around them. And I thought that was really beautiful, and I could see how it changed her to be around them too. She became very relaxed and very confident in a way that she wasn't in most areas of her life. So I found that really beautiful. And also this is a little bit trashy, I guess, but I just really liked the idea of translating a story that's kind of a white story of National Velvet into a different time and culture.
And with a Latina
Yeah.
heroine, as you'd said earlier. So what was it like to walk into that terrain? Because so much of the book, it is about, I guess, difference in a way, cultural difference, socioeconomic difference. It's about what white people think about people of color. It's what people of color think about whites. There's a lot of that kind of observation and those ideas getting put out there, but those are really charged ideas right now, and who gets to tell what story? Even you said earlier you were hesitant to write the story from that point of view. How do you inhabit that character? So how did you, move into that, or with what trepidation did you move into that?
Well, I tried my best. I think I could have, I think I handled the kind of racial element of it with a little bit too light hand. I could have been stronger with that. I mean, it's there, but it could have been more overt. It's just that I was hesitant to try to represent how Velvet and her family would experience that. I saw it. I could see it, definitely. It wasn't, I didn't just know a girl, I also knew her brother, and I definitely saw some things very plainly that I never would have seen had I not been involved with them. But I didn't know really how they experienced it, other than what they might choose to tell me. So I was hesitant to get into it in a lot of depth, so like I said, it's there, but with a fairly light hand, I think, compared to what it could be. And how did I do it? It's funny, because I was hesitant. I just thought, how could I didn't even it wasn't even I thought it was inappropriate for me to do it or wrong, because I very much believe that writers need to be able to write about different characters. It's a very weak writer who will not get out of the world that they know immediately. So that wasn't the issue for me. The issue was, can I do it?
Yeah.
Without making a complete idiot of myself. So anyway, I was agonizing about it and talking to a friend and saying, but I can't. I won't use the right language. I just won't get the feel of it right at all. And she's like, Mary, you're talking about a little girl. You were a little girl once. You're talking about this kid like she's from outer space. She lives in a different neighborhood. She's from a different socioeconomic group and a different culture. But she's not from outer space. She's still a little girl. And that's what I finally realized, that, yeah, she in some ways is not going to be that different at all.
There's a moment in the book where there's a kind of, when you were talking about it earlier, you said, there's a scene where you were reading from where Velvet hears her grandfather in her head and speaking, you promised, his voice telling her that she interprets as going to see the horse. But there's another scene in the book where this love that she's talked about in the reading, Dominic, she goes to find him, and she puts herself in a situation that's dangerous, potentially dangerous. There are a lot of people there that are much older than her. She's a beautiful young girl, and there's this sense of, and there's frequently a sense of danger around her. And her grandfather appears and kind of literally shepherds her out of that. And there's those elements of kind of ghosts or spirit figures in other ways. Was that something, how did that become a part of the narrative, and why were you interested in including that? Like, I don't want to say it's mysticism, but it's like a fantastical element of the story that I found interesting, or of the novel, you know, that kind of recurs.
Yeah, that was very much meant to be there. I do mean it to be literally. Her grandfather is there, his spirit is there protecting her. And I meant it to be stronger in my initial conception of the book. There's also a dream that Ginger has very vividly of going to hell. And Velvet, without knowing that Ginger has had that dream, also dreams that she goes into hell as a visitor, and her grandfather brings her out. But that was meant to be more of a part of it, and that there was a sort of a suggestion that there was a spiritual connection between the two families that neither one of them is aware of, but it was too complicated, so I took most of that out. I have a story where it's referred to called The Devil's Treasure, where Ginger as a little girl goes to steal, anyway. So that's why that happened, but it was originally a bigger part of it.
I mean, it's a beautiful part of the book. It's something, you know, you talked about the structure of this earlier, that one way to get around writing a novel from the point of view of a Latina girl was to break it up. So the way it works is there'll be a chapter from Velvet's point of view, a chapter from Ginger's point of view, Paul, Ginger's husband, Sylvia, Velvet's mother also have their moments, and it kind of, they you know, we flip through them, and what you see is, in a weird way, how these relationships are siloed. You know, there's a big disconnect in some ways, and there are things that they don't know about one another, even in the most intimate of relationships. But then there are these kind of connections that can happen, but it's almost like something that, the way you've set it up, it allows the reader to make those connections. I mean, even if you were making them, but you can kind of, I can start seeing, like, Sylvia has dreams about horses, and she's kind of haunted by her past. Ginger's haunted by her sister. I mean, was that an effort to try to allow that kind of opening and making connections on the part of the reader, or?
Because it's, to me, ironic that people keep saying to Ginger, you have nothing in common with this girl, this relationship can't work, and yet, unbeknownst to actually either one of them, they do have more in common. That Ginger, when she was young, was also someone who had a bad relationship with her mother and had a broken family, and really has trouble fitting in with her environment. She also has something in common with Velvet's mother without knowing it. Velvet's mother feels very alone in her environment. Is not in a Latino neighborhood, so she can't understand what people are saying around her. She's more frightened of the neighborhood than she needs to be for that reason. And Ginger, even though she lives in a materially much more nice place, also does not feel like she's part of that community at all. And while there's no physical danger for her, she feels like, and she's right, the women there don't like her, and she's not part of that either. So they all have more in common than they know, and they don't know because they wouldn't talk about those things with each other.
Yeah, there's a continuum, I realized. I mean, you've written about adolescence before, and the relationships between women in general that can be very difficult, pointed. Not, you know, people can feel very close, but they can also have really negative kind of ties. And it felt like there was a continuum of the mean girl, from Velvet's experiences with her kind of pack at school to Ginger's experiences with that pack of women in the country who she feels are constantly judging her and questioning her. The idea of not fitting in, a powerful line of that is invoked in the title, the Mare, that this is, as I said earlier, a novel about motherhood and what it means to be a mother, and who gets to be a mother and how mothering works. Because in this novel, I guess you could say Velvet has three mothers. She has her biological mother, Sylvia. She has this foster kind of mother figure, Ginger, and then even the horse, the relationship she has with the horse, with the Mare. Why were you interested in exploring motherhood?
Well, I didn't think of that as a major topic of the book, but it is. It's kind of built in. I think it's a huge issue for women. I think women who don't have children are judged, even now. Maybe in some cultures less than others, but yeah, I mean, Velvet's mother thinks that there's something terribly wrong with Ginger, and actually is envious of her for her material well-being, but also looks down on her and thinks there's something wrong with her. And Ginger also feels like there's something wrong with her. She doesn't maybe fully buy into that idea, but she does think it, and she feels that the women around her feel that way about her too, which they do. But also it's brutally hard to be a single mother, especially if you were poor and in a culture that devalues you completely because you come from somewhere else. So it's a kind of double-edged sword. I think even women who are materially fine and are married can find motherhood is very, very hard for all kinds of reasons and can turn out to be much more challenging than they thought. So yeah, I think it's a huge topic for women in every direction.
Mm-hmm. You talked about knowing a Latina girl and her brother, and you fostered children, or you not fostered, you had children come stay with you through the Fresh Air Fund. Going through that process in your own life and then writing about it in the book, what is your take on that kind of program, right? Which says, let's take inner city children and put them in this rural environment, which is very different from their home, and the hope that, you know, they kind of absorb something from that. It gives them something they're not finding in the context that they're living in.
Well, it's very complicated. My husband and I went into it with some trepidation because just on the face of it, it's a weird idea. It's not always racially clear. Sometimes the kids from the city are white. Jonathan Lethem, you may be interested to know, was a Fresh Air Fund kid. It can be just any kid in the city, but it generally is going to be poor kids, and it's generally going to be Black or Hispanic kids, because most middle-class people aren't going to send their children to stay with complete strangers. The reason that poor people do it is because they don't have many options for their children to get out and see nature. So it is very weird suddenly for these kids to go through this culture shock, and their parents aren't part of it at all.
Yeah.
When we did it, I was kind of surprised that we weren't vetted more thoroughly. The person came over to our house and talked to us for maybe 10 minutes. A criminal background check was done, that's good, but I asked her, are we going to meet the child's parents? And she said, no, why would you want to do that? And I said, well, so they could see who we were and feel more at ease, and the children would know that their parents had approved of us. And she was just like, it's not that complicated. So that right away seemed odd. But yeah, it's basically taking the kids and putting them in a situation where, although I will say this, you do not have to be middle class to be a Fresh Air Fund host. You could live in a trailer and be a Fresh Air Fund host. So the hosts do not always have a lot more than the people that they're hosting, but they usually do. And sometimes they're wealthy. So there's very young children suddenly with people who they have learned already are basically the enemy, white people. Mm-hmm. And they have it just vastly more than they could ever hope to have. And the idea is that you don't have anything, and you have to come here to see how well off we are. And also I did hear actually a conversation at a bus station, a Fresh Air Fund bus station. I overheard it. These women, these white women who I'm sure were totally well-meaning, were talking in full view of these very young children and saying things like, they don't even show up. We spend I spent all this time getting them to have a place up here, and then they don't even show, and they're always late. They just don't understand time the way we do. It's their culture. And we're giving them another way. We're giving them another example. But what they do with that, you just don't know what they're thinking. They just, and worse, I don't even want to repeat. My mouth just practically dropped open. I was like, are you not and I looked at the kids, and they didn't seem to be reacting. And I thought, is this because they're not listening, or because they hear this so all the time and they're not even registering it? And so even if those women weren't saying that, I think that that's the attitude behind a lot of it, and I think it's very destructive. But on the other side, I will say, some kids did have a good time. I did know at least one family that they developed a very strong relationship with this boy. They saw him every year. They got to know his family. They had his brothers and sisters up. They wound up actually paying for some of his college tuition. The reason we did it, in spite of our misgivings, is that my husband happened to know a woman who was a Fresh Air Fund kid, and he asked her, how was it? And she said it was mixed, but it ultimately was a good experience for her, that it was something to do in the summer that was different. She liked the family she was involved with, and she learned things that she wouldn't have learned otherwise. She learned how to handle herself socially in different situations. So I think it's a very mixed thing, although we felt ambivalent enough about it that we only did it 1 year.
Yeah.
And then we stopped going through them, and we just and we also went to their house too. We didn't just have them come up. We also sometimes went to visit them and just met them in the city and hung out. So that was a different thing. But I can't say it's totally horrible, because I think, human beings will work out arrangements in their own ways in all kinds of situations. But the premise of it is very, very, it's insulting. Just on the face of it, it's insulting. It doesn't have to be, but somehow that's what it is.
It just struck me too that, Chicago is a very segregated city. It's one of the ways we talk about this city, the most segregated, and I think we talk about race in ways that are often very abstract, but that there's also the way people actually are living, which may be much more involved across races, right? And having complicated feelings about that. And I wondered if, in some ways, this was an opportunity for you to think of that through, like through this story, where you have Ginger saying, okay, I'm a racist, and at least now I know that, when she's sort of assessing her feelings for Sylvia and that whole world that Velvet lives in. And then Velvet asks at some point, why is it that white people can walk their path in a way that black people and people of my color cannot? But that by putting these together, they're actually tapping into something that seems more like how we experience race. Maybe not how we're talking about it in the news, say, but how we're actually living it.
Well, I hope so. Like I said, I thought I could have even made it stronger, but yeah, it's the way people negotiate that is complicated. And by the way, when I was there hearing that at the bus stop, the kids I knew were not there. If they had been there and hearing that, we would have definitely had a conversation about it, and I probably would have said something to the women, but they weren't there. I don't know what I would have said. I mean, shut up. I mean,
Right.
In the context, it would have been. It might have made things worse even, I don't know, but I definitely would have talked about it with them at least. I don't know how much time we have, but yeah, it made me very aware, and not that I wasn't aware of how things are racially, but it made me even more aware. Like there was this thing that happened, which I'll try to make brief, but we're also involved with a little boy. And when he was maybe, 13 or something, he got some kind of scrap. It's in a schoolyard, not of his school. He was in a other schoolyard, and he keyed somebody's car, and he didn't want to call his mother. He was in the principal's office, and he didn't want to call his mother because he was afraid she'd be mad. So he had them call me, and they were like, telling me it will cost $400 to fix my car, so I gave the woman, I actually wrote a check and sent the woman some money and talked to her about it, and then much later, I entered something he had drawn in a contest that I knew about in a literary magazine, and he won $200. And so he was really happy about it, but he actually, this was like months later, of his own volition, offered to use that money to pay some of the, because I didn't pay her the whole thing, I didn't have it, and he said he would give some of the money to her, and I thought that was so great, and so I called her up and I told her that he had made this offer, so we went over there, and the first thing that happened was somebody handed me a bouquet of flowers, and said, here, this is for you for making a difference, and which I just found totally embarrassing. And I was like, but he's the one who's, anyway, and then we go into this room and we meet with her, and she starts talking to him and telling him how awful it was that he keyed her car and how she could have gotten in so much trouble, and he's starting out in a life of terribleness, and only because of me, he should be very thankful to me because I stepped in and been making a difference. And I'm like, he did this really great cartoon, did this great picture, and I mean, not that I didn't blame her for being mad, but she was going on and on about the negative. And then we go to talk to the principal, and he's doing the same thing. He's like going on and on about, you could have gone to jail, you could go to jail everywhere. And finally, I was just flabbergasted, and finally I stopped and said, wait a minute, why are you talking about jail? Nobody's going to jail. He's like, I don't remember how old he was. He's 14 or something. I don't think you go to jail for keying cars. And he was like, anybody could go to jail. My son could go to jail. And it was incredible. And we walked out, and I said, when he and I left, I said, that was horrible. And he said, oh, it wasn't so bad. It would have been worse if we weren't there. And I said, really? And it isn't that I'm against, it isn't that I thought they shouldn't have been, let him know that it was wrong to key the car, et cetera, but they were talking jail, I mean, over and over again. And this kid had been hearing about that since he was 6 years old. His first grade teacher, when I talked to her, at one point told me, I'd heard he was such a bad kid, and we had to call him into the principal's office and tell him next time we were gonna call the police. And I'm like, he's 6. Whatever he did, the police? So yeah, I mean, I hear about this, I've heard, it's not the first time I'd ever heard this, but it was really extreme to see it happening with this child that I know, and he was a little bit rough, but still a 6-year-old, and how frightening for him. That's basically telling him, you are so terrifying that, I mean, by the time you get to be 15, they're gonna have to call in the army. And that was really an eye-opener.
Yeah. As you're talking, a lot of the experiences that you had with these children are ones that ended up in the book in a different form. And I know you say at the end of the book that it couldn't have been, the children in this book are not the children that you met through Fresh Air Fund, but the book couldn't have happened without them. And that's something, I see, like, the autobiographical details of your life that you've shared, of your early years, running away as a teenager. I mean, that kind of comes into some of your books, like Veronica, Alison has run away and is selling flowers, details that seem to be from your life as well. And I'm just kind of wondering how the autobiographical and then the literature you produce, how those interact, if you see them interacting to a great extent or at what level.
Well, I think most writers use their own lives to one degree or another. It's difficult to not, even if it's metaphorical. I have written some stories that don't have anything to do with my life. Like Secretary, for example, had nothing at all. It really, it didn't. But I have written things that or this story, Don't Cry, isn't about my life at all either. But I think you have to at least have some metaphorical understanding of what you're writing about. A lot of things that happened in the Mare were based on real things, but a lot of the things in the Mare were not. They were completely made up. So I think it tends to be a mix for most people.
The passage you read from the Mare, when she heads out, she's singing the lyrics of a song. They're going over in her head. And I realize you write very beautifully. You integrate music into your writing in beautiful ways. There's a long passage in Veronica where Alison, again, is sort of caught up in this, like the 60s San Francisco, and she's singing this song, Earth, Wind, and Fire, Hearts of Fire, but she mistakes it. She says the word ossifier, Love's Desire, and she's just singing and kind of, it's really, really beautiful the way you write about music and how people relate to music. Maybe it comes back to that feeling again. And I was just curious about your own relationship to music and if you listen to music when you're writing or what it does for you in your writing.
I used to listen to music when I wrote a lot. Like actually, even when I was writing, when I was a teenager, I would actually write and listen to music at the same time. I don't do that now, but yeah, I sometimes, like if I'm writing and I come to a break, I'll just put on some loud music and walk around and listen to it. There's certain songs that for some reason totally inspire me for a scene. It's old, but there was a song by Missy Elliott I listened to constantly when I was writing this book. Yeah, it does inspire me in kind of an indirect way sometimes.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, I can imagine that, but just the way you integrate it into your narrative feels very different, you know? Alison, in later years, when she's looking back, she feels the loneliness of moving through all these rooms that no longer have music or people in them, which just seems like a beautiful way to think about, you know, thinking about your past and who you were and who you're no longer, as this kind of repeating of those spaces and what's happening in them. I wanted to ask you before we go to questions from the audience, you wrote a great essay, you're a wonderful essayist, and this was a long time ago, it was in the 90s, called On Not Being a Victim. And there's so much in that essay, I mean, it's too complicated to really, I don't know if I could really sum it up, but one of the things you were responding to was sort of the way in which people were talking about date rape and the rules and how we kind of manage relations between men and women and what it is we aren't supposed to do, the difficulty of just imposing a set of rules versus trying to come to understanding of how it is you want to be in the world and how to take responsibility for your own feelings and for those of others. And really trying to dig into the complexity between these very kind of opposing views, you know, like that we must, every action you must ask permission for. This was this period where we were really no means no, versus this is something that will victimize women. And where do you stand in relation to that essay now? Because we're in this moment where we're having this conversation again after the conversation between Donald Trump came out, and his talking about groping women, and there's just been this flood of women sharing these experiences of what's happened to them. And I'm curious what you're making of all of that, given that you were trying to kind of wrest with this complicated scenario at a much earlier period.
That's a really hard thing to talk about because it's complicated. I actually reread that essay recently because it's coming out in the essay collection that I have. Will come out in April, so I rewrote it a little bit, but not that much. Yeah, I am very mixed about the whole Title IX thing, and it's true that it can actually be much more sexy to ask, do you want me to do this? But it's also, I don't know how realistic it is to try and regulate the sexuality of very young people, particularly, any people really, but especially really young people, and say you have to do it this way or that way. Things happen so much in the moment. And I am a little concerned. I mean, I think it's right to try to protect girls from sexual crimes and from rape, and I think it's a strong reaction. 'Cause I'm old enough to remember when it was very, very hard to get a conviction for rape, that you had to have a witness, and that even if a woman was actually beaten, often the rapist would get off on the grounds that she was asking for it, or she was flirtatious, or she was promiscuous anyway, or something like that. So I think this is kind of an extreme overreaction, that now practically anything can be considered assault or rape. I think that people use the word rape sometimes when they mean just aggression or obnoxiousness. Like I once was having a conversation with a student, and she referred to the time she was raped in Chelsea, which is a neighborhood in New York, which is a very safe neighborhood and very widely trafficked. And I said, when did this happen? And she said, oh, it was about 10 o'clock at night. And I said, where? And she said, 7th. She named a street that's really trafficked heavily. And I said, how did that happen? And she said, well, they like just pulled me into a doorway, and then they tried to grab me, and I'm like, and I said, and then what happened? And she said, well, I just pushed, I got away. And I'm like, that's not rape. Maybe they were, I mean, it's obnoxious and it's perhaps frightening, but if that's not rape. If all they did was grab you and touch you, they didn't rape you. And she didn't contest that. We just kind of, I didn't confront her with it dramatically. I just said, oh, that's not exactly rape, and that was it. But it seems like it's like overkill now. Like people are reacting so much to things that I think women of my generation, for better or worse, took as a matter of course. Like I didn't find it shocking if men groped me or something. I kind of expected them to do that, actually, because they did. Maybe they don't anymore, but it's just like when I was younger, if I walked down the street, I didn't even have to be dressed especially provocatively, and guys would do things, boys usually, and most girls I knew had that experience, so I didn't consider it shocking or outrageous, irritating. And I would curse at people. Sometimes I'd actually hit or kick people even, but it wasn't something that I considered to be an outrage. And I'm not sure what I think of it, that it is now considered an outrage. I don't know.
Well, let's hear from some of you how you're responding to the book, and what questions you have for Mary. So Dana has her hand held.
You touched on this, but I'm imagining that with your new book, you're going to get some pushback about so-called cultural appropriation. And you said that it's a weak writer who doesn't try to get outside herself, and I get that. That's talking about it from your standpoint, from the standpoint of your craft. But I think the argument of social appropriation is from the standpoint of the appropriated. And by asking this question, I'm not advocating that point of view. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. But I imagine you have gotten or will get pushback on that, and I'm wondering how you'll answer it.
I expected to get a little bit more than I have. He was, if you couldn't hear him, he was asking if I had gotten any shit, for any criticism for it couched in terms of cultural appropriation. That hasn't happened that I know about. I personally don't like the term cultural appropriation because I think that, if you can't, people, there's cultural cross-pollination that happens all the time. And if you tried to disallow that, it would be really boring if Latino people could only write about Latino people and white people could only write about white people, and et cetera, et cetera. I don't think anyone would actually like that. I do think that sometimes, I think it came about because there's a feeling that white culture, however you want to categorize that, is taken other people's work without paying for it, or basically without giving it credit. And that unfortunately has existed, particularly in music. But I think that in general, if you're a person writing from the point of view, if you're white and writing from the point of view of a Latino character, or a black person writing from the point of view of a white character, how is that appropriating anything? That's part of your life. Unless you're living in a complete bubble, you're going to be around people of different races and different class groups, and it's not appropriating anything. It's coming from your own point of view and your own life. It's to say that you shouldn't do that seems ridiculous. I agree with you, and I don't like the term. I just think it's a very strange, awkward term. But on the other hand, what I said at the beginning, I think it's also true that if you're writing from the point of view of somebody who lives in a world and a set of circumstances you yourself have never experienced, even if it's poverty. I was very worried about writing from the point of view of Velvet's mother, which I didn't even intend to try at first, because not only does she come from a different country, it's not merely that she has her background. She's Velvet is Dominican American. She's grown up in America. She watches the same things on TV that I do, more or less. She listens to very similar music, if not actually the same music. She belongs to this culture in a big way. She's influenced by her Dominican heritage because that's where her mother came from, but she is all very much American. She reads and writes. Her mother comes from a completely different place. She does not speak the language, and she does not read or write. How am I going to put myself in the head of somebody like that? I've never lived in a neighborhood where I literally did not know what was being said around me, where I couldn't read the mail I got, where I don't even have a child. It's hard for me to imagine being dependent on my child to inform me what I'm being told by a letter that's come in. That is tough. I also don't know what it's like to be somebody who's living from hand to mouth like that. I have lived poor in my life, more so than most people from my background, because I left home when I was a teenager. So my life was pretty hand to mouth, but that was a long time ago. And I wasn't taking care of children. So I wouldn't call it cultural appropriation. I would just say that's very hard to do. So I was concerned about that, and I have gotten some comments about that people did not think I did her mother convincingly, and I'm not sure I did. I felt it was important to. I felt as I was writing the book, like I said, I didn't intend to, but I felt like if I was a reader, I'd want to know what was going on in this woman's mind. And I did feel like I could connect with her in some ways, and I wanted her to speak. So I did the best I could, and I don't think that writers are meant to be perfect. I've read books by Philip Roth where I thought he got characters all wrong, and that not because they were white, but I still felt he did it terrible. they were awful. Because when he represented a Vietnam vet in one of his books, he's never been to war. He doesn't know what that feels like. He tried his best, I'm sure. I thought it was awful, because I didn't think he represented the guy fairly, or well, forget about fairly. I didn't think he represented him well. So I may not have represented her in the best way possible. You can just try. But that, I guess that's the answer. And if there's pushback, that's okay. I mean, if people say this is wrong, that's part of the value of the book, that people can say what they feel, and I have no problem with that.
Have they decided to make a film of the Mare?
No. Well, somebody did approach me, but she was so inexperienced, and her main thing was she wanted Kara Sedgwick to play Ginger, and I didn't think Kara Sedgwick was right for Ginger at all, and she was inexperienced, and so I passed on it. But other than that, no, there hasn't.
You weren't happy with the adaptation of Secretary, right?
I didn't like it very much, no. I thought it was a little bit too sweet.
Are you interested in having adaptations? I mean, if it's cast right, or are you interested in turning any of this, short stories, or any of the novels?
I think The Mare could possibly be a better movie than a book, because if the right person directed it, whatever I got wrong culturally, they could fix. I would love to see the actress who could play Velvet, and they had the right actress for her mother. Ginger's important too. I wish Sissy Spacek was young enough to play Ginger. She'd be perfect. But the thing is, whatever I didn't get quite right culturally, the right person could do perfect. Like I really wish the guy who did The Wire did it. David, I'm forgetting his name right now. Yeah, if he did it, my God, it would be so great. But so far it hasn't happened.
Well, Mary Gaitskill, thank you so much for talking with us today. Thanks for your questions, and head to the book signing.